Bernanke's tenure as head of the US Federal Reserve will almost certainly be remembered as being one of the most testing periods in the bank's existence. With the market being told that Bernanke's tenure is coming to an end, we thought we'd look back and ask Adrian Saville, CIO of Cannon Asset Managers, to share his thoughts on what Helicopter Ben might be most remembered for. Isn't it exactly that? Dishing out loads of money across the board and pretty much the biggest experiment in history. I think you've used that terminology before.
Yeah, I have used that terminology, Bronwyn. I think aside from being remembered for his wild printing of money, he's probably going to be forgotten for taking one of the biggest hospital passes ever delivered. And what he inherited from Greenspan was an unmitigated disaster, mess. And he's been fielding that problem for the last decade.
Adrian, he's certainly been a disciple of Greenspan. I mean, I think that the size of the problem warranted it. Greenspan reverted to liquidity when everything was falling apart. So Bernanke came in and he did this massive amount of printing. But as many commentators have said, what real options did he have apart from that? I mean, if you look back as an economist and think about his tenure, do you think there's anything he'd look back and say, well, maybe there's something I could have done differently?
This is the perennial tragedy of economics, is that you never get a parallel experiment. You never get the chance to wind back the clock. In Bernanke's case, he's often accused of printing money, which I think is sort of that's a cavalier and in many ways unfair observation, because he hasn't been printing money as much as he's been transforming longer dated assets into near dated assets. In other words, he's just been putting liquidity in the system, which is different to central bank in Zimbabwe printing money, where there were no assets being replaced. So he's been helping unfreeze a banking system that was on the verge of caving in on itself, in the process of actually caving in on itself. And in many ways then, what were his options? He could have stood by and watched this collapse. And boy, would that have been a mess.
Talking about hospital passes, who's going to accept the next one? Because there's a big problem looming in terms of mopping up now that excess liquidity without causing an all-fall down scenario.
There is a big problem. I'm not sure that there's a couple of obvious candidates, and here they've got incredible continuity built into the Federal Reserve System. So there's a luxury, I think, of choice of people who might take this on. I couldn't imagine a more difficult job in this environment.
Let me rephrase Warren's earlier question. If you were Reserve Bank governor in the US, what would you have done over the time that Bernanke has been in office? You must have contemplated this.
Hundreds and hundreds of times over. I think this is a polarizing response in that there are really only three options. The one is the muddle through option. The second is the print wildly, and the third is let them fail. And I belong to the let them fail school. Now, people immediately respond by saying, but that would have been devastating to the system, as opposed to kicking the can down the road and pretending
we're going to fail at some stage.
I think that is all we've done, is we've put ourselves into, we're painting ourselves into an ever diminishing corner, and at some point something has to give. Now, it's impossible to know when that point comes and quite exactly what it is that will give. But make no mistake, if something doesn't give, then economics needs an entire reinvention. The principles, the rules of economics will be redefined.
Adrian, we've been speculating or talking about this as well, and the way I understand it is Japan's further down the road, down this kicking the can down the road, more than anyone, and they haven't imploded yet somehow. So
they haven't, yeah.
By some miracle, would it be Japan? I mean, are they the most vulnerable developed
George
market
Glinos
economy?
Certainly believes that Japan is the vulnerable point now in the global economy.
Yeah, and my friend Davy Root talks of this as a bug in search of a windshield. I agree with them entirely. This is a very bold experiment that the Japanese policymakers have pursued. I think it is an accident looking for a place to happen, and the pretense once again, or the solution once again, is to pretend that this isn't a balance sheet problem, that this is somehow something else. It is nothing other than a balance sheet problem, and that requires structural remedy. They haven't put structural remedy in place so far.
It could be a multi-decade problem, continue to be way beyond this point and way beyond our lifetimes. In fact, the travesty could happen when we are, how do you say that politely?
We've
passed
sailed onto the
absolutely
greener pastures. Yeah.
And that's the reality here.
Yeah.
We could sustain this kicking down the can for many, many decades to come.
So, I think my flip and throwaway on this, and I've said it before, is you're making a forecast here, and if you're going to make a reliable forecast, either forecast an event or a time, never both. And here I'm forecasting an event. This is an accident. You have built a mountain of liquidity. You've taken interest rates down to unsustainable levels. And if interest rates do anything remotely close to normalization, the Japanese government budget goes from spending about a quarter of the budget revenue on interest repayments to 100%. How does that transpire without collapsing some form of social fabric, or social fabric as we know it? So this is why I don't think we're reading between...
the money, Warren. I don't know about you, but I don't want to be part of that, the alternative here.
We're not reading between the lines here. We're reading off the page.
Adrian, we've got the situation in America where and Bernanke was a great student of what happened in the Great Depression.
Yeah.
At some point, they've got to withdraw the liquidity. Has there ever been a textbook case in history where this amount of liquidity is either stopped or reversed? Is there any sort of playbook as to what happens next? Because that will fundamentally be the challenge facing the next governor of the
As I said,
Federal
nobody
Reserve.
wants to put up their hand for that job.
Warren, there are examples, but the challenge is that the examples that we point to are individual cases. And the reality now is we have a synchronized balance sheet problem. That it's not just one big government with a problem. Rather, it's a number of large economies that are simultaneously trying to resolve this. So, we can point to individual cases. If you think of the Nordic economies in the 1990s, fantastic single country examples.
Let's bring it closer to home and stop talking about the world's problems. We've got enough on our home ground. But perhaps some positivity coming out of the mining situation, although, Adrian, I don't really think it's being reflected adequately in the rand, if that's a fair statement to make. We're sitting at 10 on dollar rand still, and you would assume that if all had been settled in the mining environment, that you would see some tangible impact on the local unit.
If everything is solved, if we can miraculously transform this overnight to a solved situation, our fair value estimate for the rand is close to 6 to the dollar. That's on purchasing power parity. And the power of purchasing power parity is that it is a really good model for explaining long run currency moves. The suggestion then is that what you're seeing here is political discount, and it's big.
We've got this situation where the Deputy President, acting obviously on behalf of the President, is trying to do everything in his power to get the parties together and get some sort of framework for negotiation and dispute resolution, I guess you can call it. But are there not some broader forces at play here? Because this all relies on two unions that are effectively competing with each other for the electorate in that mining industry. So while there is a framework being put in place, I still haven't seen any incentives for the unions to change their behavior. Or was there something you saw in that agreement on Friday that changed your mind?
There's nothing that causes me to change my mind dramatically. I think you've hit it right on the head. The challenge here is two unions that are jockeying for power and influence. And I think that is one aspect. There's a lovely point that's made in a column this morning, which flags the need to understand complexity, though. And if we point to just the unions or the dispute between, or the stresses between union and employer, I think that's just too naive, too simple. This is a remarkably complex problem. You can trace the roots back through South Africa's long, turbulent, stressed mining history. This is not a few years in the making. And even if we are to resolve this in a wonderful political moment, it doesn't address the bigger issue, and the bigger issue is productivity. And there is a difference here between the price of labor and the cost of labor.
Let's talk about making money. Where can you make money in the local market, if anywhere?
Well, listening to the discussion just before the break, I think that there is here's my word for this show, bipolar. And there's a bipolarity going on. And some of the reasons that you can flag are very obvious. In the resource cluster, we see resources as being priced at levels that you've seen once every couple of decades. Now, to go into resources right now, you need Teflon coating. But that exactly is what strikes us as the type of
and you've got plenty
factor.
of Teflon coating as a value manager, don't you?
Well, I don't think you can, as true value, I don't think you can have anything else. But in the resource cluster, fantastic opportunities in industrials in South Africa, but certain pockets of industrial. There's a basket of industrials that are widely loved, widely owned, and our estimate is that they are probably in the order of 100% overpriced. We've used cyclically adjusted price earnings multiples, we've used price book multiples, we've used cash flow, cash sales, market sale. You can really choose your multiple. What we see here is a basket of equities that are priced for perfection, and they need to retrace 50%, or they need to deliver spectacular earnings very, very quickly. In the absence of those earnings, they need to retrace on price.
Warren, the last question goes to you.
Adrian, I just wanted to ask you, the resources, as you say, look very attractive. What do you see on the commodity side? Because that's obviously the first number that you plug into the model. Do you take the same approach to cyclically adjusting commodity prices as well? And where does that lead you at this point?
The commodity story, we step back and look at structural issues. And from a structural perspective, you've got a world made up of 7 billion people. 1 billion live in the advanced world, 6 billion live in the emerging world, or dynamic markets. That part of the world economy is growing at 5% per annum. And that part of the world economy has a demand for catalytic converters, aluminium, steel, coal, and other items. At the moment, 600 million cars driven in the world, 500 million in the rich world, 100 million in the poor world. That is a powerful structural force that I think supports commodity prices for a very long time.